touching to see you all here. It is a weekday evening, and I know that we are not in anybody's backyard. And so the fact that you're here and you've given up your time, and hopefully I can convince you to do so for 3 more Monday nights, means a lot to me, and I hope to make it worth your while. My thesis advisor in graduate school was once asked why it is that his work focuses on the 18th and the 19th century and not the 20th. And he answered in his inimicably cynical fashion that there's a difference between people who lived in the 18th and 19th century on the one hand and those who lived in the 20th century. You see, those who lived in the 18th and 19th century are dead. And the thing about dead people is you can talk about them and they don't talk back. I think, though, if you caught him in a moment of seriousness, he would have said the same thing that I say. In terms of my fascination with the 18th and the 19th century, it's not because the people who lived then can't talk back. It's because if you want to understand the world that we live in, you want to understand the Jewish world that we live in, well, so much of what we see today has its roots in the 18th and the 19th century, particularly here in the United States, but it's true in Israel as well. We're not here to tell the story over these next 4 weeks of Jewish history, of modern Jewish history, but we're here to tell the story of modern Judaism, of Judaism as practiced in its current fashion. And if you want to tell that story, the place to start is indeed in the 19th century. Brody, we are paused. There we go. Okay, good. So, somebody asked me if you're going to be tested on this. The answer is yes. And this is kind of the outline of everything we're going to do over the course of the next 4 weeks. So here it is in front of you, committed to memory, right? And it will help you as we navigate through our story. Well, the truth of the matter is, no, actually, you don't have to take a picture of it now. It's going to come back, right? The truth of the matter is, I don't even expect you to understand half of what is there on the screen right now. But what I wanted to do is point out 2 things before we start. The first is that the bulk of our story is going to happen from about the year 1818 till about the year 1885. So for the next 4 weeks, that's primarily our focus, is in the bulk of the 19th century. We're going to start today by talking about what happens beforehand, and in each of our lectures, I'm going to take it down into what happens here in the United States and sort of the outgrowths of it, but the focus for us is going to be in the 19th century. But what is more important for me right now is not that you can read this or that it makes much sense or that you recognize the names that are on the screen, but actually I want to point out the colors. You notice that? There's 4 different colors on the screen. The reason I pointed out is because I'm going to tell the story over the next 4 weeks as 4 separate stories, so that we can sort of follow the through line as we see the development of the Reform movement, the development of the Ultra-Orthodoxy, the development of Neo-Orthodoxy, and the development of what is known as the conservative movement today. But the truth of the matter is they did not happen in linear fashion. They are all happening side by side. Ping pong balls, knocking off of one another. One makes the move and something else happens as a result. And I want you to see that by looking at this, right? All the different colors here, all sort of merged together. And it's important to know that that's happening, that we're going to pull out each strand and tell it as a separate story, but it's not a separate story. It's all happening in this sort of mix of 19th century Western Europe. Good. So our story then for today begins in the 18th century, But to understand what happens in the 18th century, we need to back up one step earlier. And I want to tell this story through the lens of one particular individual or one particular family. You see, the world prior to the 19th century, the Jewish world prior to the 19th century, was a world that looked in Europe, not in the Sephardic lands, and I know there are many here who come from the Sephardic lands, but in Europe, the world of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe did not look terribly different from one another. And the best way to illustrate this is the fact that there are people who would go back and forth. Now, sometimes you would go back and forth because for business purposes, for marriage purposes, but very often the people who would most often go back and forth were rabbis. You could take a position in Eastern Europe, take another position in Central Europe, and then move on to Western Europe, because the communities were culturally quite similar. It was a fit. Let me show you. So Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levin, and also known as Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, Tzvi Hirsch Berliner, Aryeh Leb Levin. Before you had set last names, people were known by a whole bunch of different things depending on where and at what time in their life. Not a household name, I would say, necessarily, even in learned Orthodox circles, but actually he was quite a well-respected rabbi. You can see his name kind of included down there. And by the way, if you don't read Hebrew, don't worry, you're not going to need to. But pointing out only that he was included, his comments on the Talmud were included in the printing of the Vilna Shas, which means he was a well-known authority on Jewish law. Well, Tzvi Hirsch Levin was a rabbi himself. I'm a descendant of a rabbi. His father was a rabbi, and his grandfather was a great rabbi known as the Chacham Tzvi. So what I wanted to point out is the following. If we go to Tzvi Hirsch Levin's upbringing or his father's career, and his father was a community rabbi, and as often happens to community rabbis and heads of school, they tend to travel sometimes, right? And they'll spend some period of time in this town, and then they'll move on. If it's an up-and-comer, right? So they'll move up to a bigger town, to a bigger position. And so Aryeh Leb Lowenstein, which is his father, spent his career here in Eastern Europe, what we would know today as Poland, right, and Ukraine, and then moves over to Amsterdam. And he spends the bulk of his career, his later career, as the rabbi in Amsterdam. In the period we're talking about, the middle of the 18th century, that could be done. Amsterdam would hire an Eastern European Polish rabbi without even thinking about it. However, his son is also a rabbi, and his son's career looks like that. He too had to move from community to community. He becomes the chief rabbi of London, the chief rabbi of Berlin. But by the time you get to the turn of the 19th century, Eastern European communities are not hiring Western European rabbis. And vice versa. It is rare for a Western European community to hire an Eastern European rabbi. Why? What's changed? What's different about the Jewish world by the turn of the 19th century as opposed to 100 years later? Well, the best way to sum it up would be the movement we know as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a cultural, intellectual, religious, world-turning set of ideas, ultimately a movement in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western Europe, that basically turns everything that Western Europeans thought they knew on its head. It is a movement or a set of ideas that begins to focus on rationalism, on how we know what we know, On what proof and evidence can I muster for the things in my world that I take as a given? It will begin to question the authority of the past as a source of authority at all. It will begin to question received tradition, whether from religion or elsewhere, as a source of fact or knowledge. It will begin to question science and ask how it is that we know what we think we know about the scientific world. It will start to ask deep questions about freedom, government. It is the birthplace of ideas around democracy, human rights. All of this begins to emerge from the Enlightenment. The picture you see in front of you is of a French salon. Right? A salon is not a room, it's not a place, it's a gathering. It's a gathering of people interested in ideas who would come together in the 17th, the 18th century, and they would talk and they would debate, and you can see just from the painting itself, right? People moving their hands, moving their arms, speaking out, reading, debating. This is an intellectual environment like the likes of which the world has never before seen. This is happening in the 17th and the 18th century. And slowly this begins to creep in to the Jewish community of the West as well. This is happening in Germany, and it's happening in France, and it's happening in the western parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's happening in England, and it's happening in Amsterdam. It is not happening in Poland or Russia, with Ukraine, at least not at this point. And this begins to seep in, and it begins to make a difference. So in the 1700s, if I was a rabbi and I came to the community in Western Europe, what language are the Jews there speaking? Yiddish. They're speaking Yiddish. So I can go from Krakow to London, and I can communicate with everybody. By the time, 100 years later, what language are they speaking in Germany? German. And in France? French. And in England, they're speaking English. The community has been thoroughly seeped with many of these new ideas, some of them consciously, some of them unconsciously, absorbed by the community. So, this is where our story begins. In a community that is and has been rapidly undergoing change over the past 100 years. Well, the Enlightenment itself was a set of ideas. But what made the Enlightenment so interesting, right, is the way in which those ideas spread and ultimately will culminate in political upheaval as well. 1787, Solomon Maimon, he is a Polish Jew. Now, I want to be clear. Solomon Maimon is not your typical Polish Jew. Okay, but Solomon Maimon is a Polish Jew who makes his way to Western Europe. And amongst the many things that make Solomon Maimon interesting and unique is that he leaves us an autobiography. He gives us an account of what it was like and what he felt like and what he saw. So here we go. Let's read Solomon Maimon together. Meanwhile, my wife and eldest son arrived from Poland. That is, he left without them. A woman of rude education and manners, but of great good sense and the courage of an Amazon, she demanded that I should at once return home with her, not seeing the impossibility of what she required. I had now lived some years in Germany, had happily emancipated myself from the fetters of superstition and religious prejudice, had abandoned the rude manner of life in which I had been brought up, and extended my knowledge in many directions. I could not therefore return to my former barbarous and miserable condition, deprive myself of all the advantages I had gained, and expose myself to rabbinical rage at the slightest deviation from the ceremonial law or the utterance of a liberal opinion. I represented to her that this could not be done at once, and that I should require first of all to make my situation known to my friends here as well as in Berlin, and solicit from them the assistance of 200 or 300 thalers, so that I might be able to live in Poland independent of my religious associates. But she would listen to nothing of all this, and declared her resolution to obtain a divorce if I would not go with her immediately. And here, therefore, it was for me to choose the less of two evils, and I consented to the divorce. Other than his sarcasm and wit, what do we hear from this passage? He is enlightened. Okay, what has he encountered in the West? Openness, culture, education. These worlds are completely different to him. And now, how does he view the world of the East? Yeah, barbaric, miserable, not a place he wants to go back to. These were the ideas in the 18th century, but the truth of the matter is that as much as he may have felt enlightened, the truth of the matter is that living in Western Europe as a Jew in 1787 or the 1770s, or the 1760s, wasn't a terribly free place for a Jew to live. Jews were still very much outsiders, politically, legally, in almost every scenario one might imagine until 1789. Right? Because in 1789, the ideas of the evolution of the revolution, of the Enlightenment had come to a head with the French Revolution. Beginning with the bourgeoisie and then with the help of the proletariat, the French will overthrow the monarchy. They will take the ideas which have been circulating in Western Europe for the last 200 years, partially inspired by what happens here in the United States first, but very much a result of taking these ideas and bringing them, creating a new reality on the ground based on Enlightenment ideas. And so the French Revolution, 1789, begins for the first time to try to bring the Enlightenment into the world of politics and the world of ordinary reality. So it shouldn't surprise us that immediately after the storming of the Bastille, the new revolutionary government in France comes together and makes this official. They create what is known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, created by the National Assembly, August 1789. And when you open this text, it reads like an enlightened document. And here's what it says. Article 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good. Article 10, no one may be disturbed for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestation does not trouble the public order established by the law. What does this mean for Jews? What does it mean? They're free for the first time, since they had sovereignty in their own land, some 1700 years earlier. Jews have been fully emancipated. They cannot be disturbed for their opinions, even religious ones. They are men. They are born and remain free. They have equal rights, or at least they should have. Yet, just a few months later, there is a debate in the halls of that very same assembly as to what to do with the Jew. What to do with the Jew? And Count Clermont-Tonnet offers the following in his defense of the Jewish people. He writes, "But they say to me, the Jews have their own judges and laws. I respond that it is your fault, and you should not allow it. We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to Jews as individuals. We must withdraw recognition from their judges. They should only have our judges. We must refuse legal protection to the maintenance of the so-called laws of their Judaic organization. They should not be allowed to form in the state either a political body or an order. They must be citizens individually. But some will say to me, they do not want to be citizens. Well then, if they do not want to be citizens, they should say so, and then we should banish them. It is repugnant to have in the state an association of non-citizens and a nation within a nation. In short, sirs, the presumed status of every man resident in a country is to be a citizen." This is a defense of Jews. From it, we can begin to hear what the arguments against giving Jews full rights were. What are they? Why not? Why would a Jew be different? Why not? How do you know that? What?
idea of Zion.
Their
Oh.
own nation and their own system, that even judicial system, they have their own laws.
Yeah. Sure, we're willing to give every French citizen equal rights as long as you are allegiant to France. But if you have your own set of laws, if you only get along or get together, you only eat, you only drink with people who are like you, and 3 times a day you stand up and say, God, get me out of here, take me to a different country, well then, go, right? One or the other. Either you're a citizen here and you do what we do here, in which case you can get all the rights that are coming to you, or you belong someplace else. You're not a citizen of France. Well, the truth of the matter is that France does emancipate its Jews. It does. Jews now, for the first time in France, have full rights like anybody else. Well, what happens shortly thereafter? We know that this government put into place immediately after the French Revolution doesn't last very long. There's the reign of terror. Things go horribly wrong. And in comes the great savior, Napoleon, who ultimately determines that democracy actually isn't the best way to spread the ideas of enlightenment, but it's actually only an enlightened absolutist, a dictator who believes in the ideas of enlightenment, that has the ability to actually take this and carry it out and bring it to the world. And so we know that Napoleon tries to do exactly that, and he is rather successful. So over the course of the first decade of the 19th century, Napoleon, who begins here in France, will actually succeed in conquering, or at least allying, almost all of Western Europe with him. He conquers them, right? Spain, Kingdom of Spain. Anybody know who the King of Spain was during this time? Well, Jerome, Napoleon's brother, right? And so he does in each of these places, he installs leaders who are subservient and loyal to him, and who will take his ideas and the ideas of the French Revolution and enact them in that region. So now let's think about what this means for the Jew. In the 1780s, France emancipated its Jews. What happens now over the course of the first decade of the 19th century? Jews in Spain and the German states, right? And parts of Austria, right? Areas which actually today were Poland. You see here it's called the Duchy of Warsaw, Prussia, pretty much all of Western Europe. Jews have been emancipated. The proverbial ghettos have been brought down. It is a new day and a new dawn for the Jewish community. All of a sudden, access to things like universities, jobs, guilds, owning land, professions, things that Jews could never do before. For almost 2,000 years, Jews couldn't, they were completely banned from those things. In Western Europe, all of a sudden, it's now open. How does the story of Napoleon end? Defeat, yes. Right? Napoleon, huh? That is true, right? Ultimately, though, right, he attempts, right, to conquer Russia as well, right? Doesn't go terribly well for him, and he's forced to retreat all the way back to Paris. Now what happens? And what happens for the Jew? Well, you can imagine, right, that not everybody in the German states, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Duchy of Warsaw, the Empire of Austria, the Kingdom of Prussia, not all these people actually wanted to be French. Like, we might imagine such a thing, right? And perhaps they didn't exactly approve or welcome Napoleon riding in and taking over and making them part of some sort of universal citizenship of mankind under these universal principles. Well, you know what happens when somebody tries to tell you, right, that you're actually part of this sort of French Republic and this universalist, right, outlook. It actually inspires you to feel what? Yeah, rebellious. What do you actually want to feel like? German, a Prussian, an Austrian. It actually has the reverse effect. And so when Napoleon falls, what comes in its place is a rise of nationalism, of people wanting to express their own sense of history, their own sense of pride, their own sense of identity. And what do you think this does to the Jewish community? Are Jews Germans? Not by their definition. Are Jews Prussians? Nope. They're not Austrians either. And so you went from this moment of euphoria, of freedom, emancipation, first time in 2,000 years, and literally within just a few years, by 1812, it's all gone, with the exception of France. It's all gone. Okay. So, what does this have to do with modern Judaism? Well, let's place ourselves in the shoes of a young Jew living at this momentous time as we're switching from the 18th into the 19th century. So the first thing you need to understand is that post-revolutionary, post-French Revolution, is that there's a feeling of everything is new. Everything is new. The world has been turned on its head. And in fact, the French revolutionaries wanted you to think that way. You know, the revolutionaries in France actually started counting the years again from zero. They wanted to start over. Everything is starting again, right? It is a brand new world post-French Revolution. And if you are a young person, a young Jew, you feel that. Remember, you're embedded in this culture. Right? You've been reading those same things. You've been speaking German or French or English for the past 100 years in your home. You might even have an education, at least an elementary and secondary education. Right? You feel a part of that, and now there's this new world. Not only is there this new world, right? But at least in some parts, at least in that first decade, you're actually feeling the political results of it. So the first thing that you're feeling as a young Jew at the time is that the way I practice my religion doesn't exactly feel like it's with the times. The times have changed. And you know what hasn't? Judaism. This is a town in Prussia. Prussia ultimately becomes Germany, right? Not Russia, Prussia. So this is a medieval map of the town of Dresden. And like most medieval towns, the largest structure, sorry, it's down here, right? The largest structure, this would be the castle of the noble, right? The largest structure in the town would be the church. You have a courtyard in the middle of the town, a place where people would come, where you'd set up your market. There's probably gallows over there because that's what you did in the center of town as well. That's the synagogue in Dresden. And that was fairly typical of a European synagogue, largely because there were generally laws against how tall a synagogue could be, how big it could be. You certainly could never overshadow the church, and probably most other buildings in the town as well. This is what a church looked like, and this is what a synagogue looked like. This is Celle, a small town in Germany, I believe in the north. This is one of the few remaining, there aren't that many remaining German shuls, unfortunately, from the Middle Ages. This one continues to exist from the 18th century. This is what it looks like from the outside. Not terribly different than what you would find in Eastern Europe. And this is what it looked like in the inside. Now, this has been redone and refurbished because it is still an active synagogue today. But this is pretty much right, what you would have encountered if you had walked into a synagogue in the beginning of the 19th century in Germany. Fairly simple, a little balcony up front, wooden structures inside, not terribly big. It looks pretty much like synagogues have looked for hundreds of years. The problem, if you were living in early 19th century Germany, is that if you walked down the block, you would see that. And that looked very different. And I'm not just talking about the fact that it looked different. This feels awe-inspiring. This is a place of worship. You walk in it and it looks like this. And you feel the presence of God in such a place very differently than walking into my local shtiebel. It doesn't do it for me anymore. And you have to remember these churches, by the way, it's a Protestant church, not a Catholic church. These churches were not just they were not just places of prayer. What else did you do in a church in Western Europe in the 18th and 19th century? Well, these were the great cultural bastions, right, as well, most famously places for music. Right? All the great composers, Mozart, Bach, right, Beethoven, they would play in churches because the acoustics were amazing, but that's where you would go for any sort of cultural activity. You wouldn't come to a little shul, right, with some wooden chairs and benches. Was not a cultural hub of anything. And so as a young Jew growing up in this time, I look to this and I say, wow. Again, Protestantism was seen as sort of the enlightened religion. Right? This is something that speaks to me as a young cultural Jew. Right? My shuls do not. So it might have been this. Right? In Berlin, it would have looked like this. And that. Right? What is this? An organ. Right? A massive organ. If you've ever heard church music, right, played on an organ like that, it is incredibly powerful, incredibly, right, awe-inspiring. What kind of organ do you have in my shul? None? None? I'd be lucky if I've got somebody who can carry a tune, right? This is elevating. That is not. And so what begins to happen in the first decades of the 19th century is that the focus begins to be on how can I make my shul, how can I make my service more aesthetically pleasing? How can it look better? How can it sound better? Decorum was a big issue. Decorum, I don't know what it's like in your shul, right? But decorum in the shuls in Germany in the early 19th century wasn't terribly good. People would come, they would schmooze, they would talk. You walked into a Protestant church and it was silent. Right? And so we have the first synagogue that is built in a town called Seesen in Germany, that is built modeled after a Protestant church. It looks more impressive. Here's what a description of the dedication of the temple in Seesen in 1810 sounded like. After the procession had entered the temple proper, there came from the organ loft lovely music by 60 to 70 musicians and singers, and this put all the hearts into the most solemn mood. After everyone had taken his seat, a cantata, composed especially for this celebration by Dr. Heinroth, one of the teachers at the Jacobson Institute, was sung splendidly to the accompaniment of the rousing sound of the instruments. In solemn silence, the long procession from the auditorium of the school, this was the school building, this was the new synagogue, through the doors into the street, and again through the doors of another house, and through this house into the court of the temple. Special admissions cards had been printed for this festival in order to preserve order, and they had been distributed amongst all the participants in the procession. After the procession had entered the temple proper, there came from the organ loft lovely music by 60 to 70 music singers. Sorry, this we saw already. Okay. The Jewish ritual now began, with Mr. Jacobson himself being the chief officiant, and the rabbis assisting him. So Mr. Jacobson, Israel Jacobson, a wealthy businessman living in Germany at the time who feels like our community needs something more proper. He starts the school and then he builds this synagogue. Is he a rabbi? He is not. He's a layperson. He, though, is the chief officiant at the ceremony. At the end, President Jacobson gave an address which we bring further on in excerpt. After the scrolls of the Torah, which were elaborately ornamented, had been taken from the ark with great ceremony, they were carried around the temple 7 times, preceded by boys with burning wax candles. Then several chapters of the Pentateuch, the Chumash, were read, first in Hebrew and at once in German, publicly and with a loud voice. Mr. Schott, director of the educational institution, then mounted the rostrum and talked to the assembled multitude. Then came a chorale accompanied by organ and full orchestra, and this was sung first in Hebrew and then also in German. At the end of the song, in the singing of which the Christians and Israelites participated with deep emotion, Church Counselor Heinemann delivered an address befitting the occasion. After this address, there were further songs by the choir. Wow, this is different. Order, procession, loft, choir, organs, Christians, Jews, reading in Hebrew, reading in German. Any young person who would have participated in this then would have had and a young Jew, their eyes opened to something that was totally different than anything they had experienced before, and something extremely similar to what their Christian neighbors were experiencing as well. Here's what Itzel Jacobson had to say. Be it far from me that I should have any secret intention to undermine the pillars of your faith, to diminish your old and honored principles through the glitter of new opinions, or that because of some hidden vanity I should become a traitor to both our religion and you. You know my faithful adherence to the faith of my fathers. I need not protest it. My actions will witness for me more than my words, but if I do seek here first some rapprochement between you and our Christian neighbors, I would ask for more for your gratitude and honest help than for your criticism or even opposition. For your true and progressive enlightenment depends upon this rapprochement, that is the getting together of Jews and Christians. On it depends the education of your spirit for true religiosity, and at the same time also your future greater political welfare. For who dared to deny that our service is sickly of many useless things, that in part it has denigrated into the thoughtless recitation of prayers and formula, that it kills decision more than encourages it, that it limits our religious principles to that fund of knowledge which for centuries has remained in our treasure houses without increase and without ennoblement. On all sides, enlightenment opens up new areas for development. Why should we remain behind? Is he out to change Judaism? He says no. No. Is he a traditional Jew in every sense of the word, keeping Shabbat, keeping Kashrut 100%? But what is he seeking to do to bring Judaism up with the times? Make it so that it actually speaks to people today, because people come to these small synagogues, they mumble a bunch of words, they don't know what they're saying, it does nothing for their hearts, it doesn't inspire anybody. He's trying to fix that. But there's another curious line in there. Everybody see it? It's not only good for your religious welfare, but also for your future greater political welfare. What does that mean? What is he referring to? What does this have to do with politics? Well, where are we? We're in 1810. What is happening in 1810? Well, Napoleon has invaded, right? Napoleon is at his height almost in 1810. But there is a vision in a sense that perhaps this won't last. And indeed, by 1812, it doesn't. And now Jews have a dual motivation for change. Because on the one hand, there is a grassroots desire for a Judaism that speaks to the heart, that is in line with a culture that has been part of our world for 200 years up until that point. But there is also a feeling, going back to the debate we saw in the halls of the French Assembly, there is a sense that if we actually want to be fully accepted by the people around us, what do we need to do? Well, not just assimilate, but we need to prove that we deserve it. We need to prove to them that we're not some sort of barbaric, ancient people that keeps to ourselves. And so there are dual motivations that begin to emerge even as early as 1810. By the time we get to the end of that decade, we begin to usher in a new period. If up until about 1818, the focus has been on aesthetic reforms, and other synagogues will will follow the model of Season. Israel Jacobson himself will move from Season to Berlin. He will have similar types of synagogue of services first in his home, but there's no space anymore. They move to the home of a man named Beer is his last name, and so the temple, the Beer temple in Berlin, will open in a very similar fashion, and others will begin to follow it. So there'll be things like, oh, by the way, the organ. The organ then was played for these types of ceremonies, right? But not, of course, on Shabbat. But a place that has decorum, a place that has music, a place that is beginning to translate things into a language that people can speak. This begins to pick up. All of it, though, in the realm of what we would call the aesthetic. From 1818 through about 1844, we begin to see these reforms move from the world of aesthetics into the world of religion. To the point where by 1883, the graduation banquet of a rabbinical college in the United States features little neck clams, soft shell crabs, amongst other things. And so the question is, how did we get there? How did we go from Israel Jacobson in 1810 saying, I am not coming to undermine anything. I am not coming to shake your faith. I'm simply coming to improve the aesthetics of what we're doing, to 70 years later, what was fondly or not so fondly known as the Treifa banquet. That's our story. So, story for today is going to follow our orange boxes here. So we started up in the European Enlightenment. We talked about the French Revolution, this period of aesthetic reform, and now into the period of religious reform. And this story begins here in 1818 with something known as the Hamburg Temple controversy. In 1817, a group of Jews living in the German city of Hamburg decided they too want a temple in the model of Jacobson's temple in Season and then his temple in Berlin. And so they get together and they create the New Israelite Temple Association, which was to have a constitution that read as follows. Since public worship has for some time been neglected by so many, because of the ever-decreasing knowledge of the language in which alone it has until now been conducted. Which language? Hebrew, meaning young Jews in Germany don't speak Hebrew. They don't understand Hebrew. And so they're not going to synagogue services because they don't understand what is being said. And also because of many other shortcomings which have crept in at the same time, the undersigned, convinced of the necessity to restore public worship to its deserving dignity and importance, have joined together to follow the example of several Israelite congregations, especially the one in Berlin. They plan to arrange in this city also for themselves as well as others who think as they do a dignified and well-ordered ritual according to which the worship service shall be conducted on Shabbat and holy days and on other solemn occasions, and which shall be observed in their own temple to be erected especially for this purpose. Anybody see anything terribly scandalous there yet? There is one thing that's interesting. When is this synagogue going to operate? Yeah, only on Shabbat and holidays, right? Which is certainly a deviation from the way synagogues had until boy. But people aren't even coming for Shabbat and holidays, so we may as well open it, right, for that. But so far, this seems pretty in line with what we've seen up until this point. Specifically, they write, there shall be introduced at such services a German sermon and choral singing to the accompaniment of an organ. Incidentally, the above-mentioned ritual shall not be confined to the services in the temple. Rather, it shall apply to all those religious customs and acts of daily life which are sanctified by the church or by their own nature. Outstanding amongst these are the entrance of the newly born into the covenant of the fathers, that is the Brit Milah, weddings and the like. Also, a religious ceremony shall be introduced in which the children of both sexes, after having received adequate schooling in the teachings of the faith, shall be accepted as confirmation of the Mosaic religion. What are we referring to here? Bar mitzvah and, far more radical, bat mitzvah, something which did not exist prior to this point. We shall confirm both boys and girls. Okay. Ultimately, there were three areas in which the Hamburg Temple kind of began to break new ground and began to suggest something that actually hadn't been done in prior versions of these types of temples. The first, they were actually going to, by ritual and intentionally, say parts of tefillah every day or on Shabbat and holidays in German. Number two, they were going to take out any references to a temple or to a return to Zion from anywhere in the service. Why? Huh? Why?
Faithful to Germany. It's not being like a nation. It's being as a religion, like, and that's it.
Why?
We are Germans and we practice this religion.
Yes, why?
Part of
What was pushing them to do that? Okay, we're in 1817 now. Napoleon's gone. Rights are gone. German Jews are right back to where they were, except that they have all this education and they have all this culture. They can't go back. Right? Remember Solomon Maimon, he's not going back to Poland. No German Jew is going back to metaphorical Poland. We're not going back there. We can't. That's not who I am. I don't even speak Hebrew. I don't understand the Talmud. I'm not going back there. I need to be accepted as part of German society. What's more, I want to attend university. I want to be able to get a job. I want to be able to integrate into this community. Well, the only way I'm going to get there is if I convince those around me that I belong here. And how do I convince them that I belong here? I stop saying, God, get me out of here. I stop wishing. Right? By the way, did you notice the association? What kind of association is it? The New Israelite Temple Association. That's correct. They referred to it as a temple. Likely not, right, incidental. Right? This was going to be their temple. Their temple is going to be here in Hamburg, not back in Israel. So the third, an organ. An organ was going to be played. It's central to how they worshipped in Germany at that time, but it was going to be played along with a choir to the accompaniment of, by a non-Jew on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So here's an example of what it looks like. This, you can see, this is the, I don't know if anybody here speaks German, right? But this is the prayer book that they put out with their temple in 1819. You can see Hamburg down here. I'm going to show it to you in Hebrew, and then I will show it to you in English. This comes from the Musaf service that's said on Shabbat and on holidays. This is their text, and this is the text that the today's Orthodox Siddur, or the traditional Siddur, has. Right? So this text, I guess maybe I'll show you, and then I'll switch it over into English. The yellow has all been removed. Okay, the yellow has all been removed, and one little phrase here has been added. Right, so let me show it to you in English. So you can see the lines that have been crossed out. And due to our sins, we were exiled from our territory and distanced from our land. We cannot go up to present ourselves and bow before you and perform our obligation in your chosen house. And down here, may it be your will, Hashem, our God, God of our forefathers, that you return us and have mercy on us, on your temple, and your abundant mercy, speedily build it and restore its honor. Our Father, our King, reveal your honor of your kingdom quickly upon us, so on and so forth. Bring us to Zion, your city, in joy, and to Jerusalem, your temple, in everlasting happiness. Right, so follow me. May it be your will, Hashem. May it be your will, Hashem. Right, our God and the God of our forefathers, merciful King, that you, delete all this, accept the expressions of our lips with mercy and favor in place of our sacrifices. Which ones? The daily sacrifices and the additional sacrifices according to the proper order and laws. And then in place of the additional sacrifice of the day, we have this. That is how they went about editing the Siddur. Okay. Soon thereafter, important point. So they wanted to start a synagogue, big deal. Right? Well, the way things worked in Western Europe, most of Western Europe, still to this point, is that you can't just open up a synagogue. All synagogues come under government control. In fact, it's that way still in many Western European countries, right? A consistory or a consistoire, right? Which is a government body that oversees all religious life. So you actually need to appeal to the government in order to open a synagogue, because communal funds were actually taxed. The community was taxed. The community would raise funds, right? This would go through the government, and then you would get the communal institutions, the religious institutions would get their funding through the government. So these were all had to go through the government. So if this New Israelite Temple Association wanted to open a new synagogue, it needed to petition the government of Hamburg to allow it to open a synagogue. Well, as you can imagine, there were some in Hamburg, particularly the rabbis there, who weren't necessarily enthralled with this idea of having a new kind of synagogue in town. And so immediately thereafter, the petitioners, those who were trying to open this synagogue, turned to a man by the name of Aaron Chorin, who was a rabbi actually in Hungary at the time, but a well-known sort of Talmid Chacham, somebody who had a lot of Jewish learning behind him, and asked him to write a work that would show why, from a perspective of Jewish law, from halacha, everything they were trying to do was perfectly permissible. And who did they have to prove this to? The government. The government needed to know this was all within the purview of halacha because they needed to be Jewish. And how were we going to define Jewish other than this is what Jewish law says to do? So I needed to be sure that this synagogue was in line with Jewish law. And so this book, Nogad Tzedek, was written in 1818 by Aaron Chorin, which details why all the three major things, right? Taking out pieces of the tefillah, playing an organ by a non-Jew, right? And doing some of the tefillah in German were all permissible from a Jewish law perspective. Well, things are going to begin to turn even more seriously by the time we get to 1819. By the time we get to 1819, riots break out throughout much of Western Europe. They're known as the Hep riots. And there's various reasons for them. They're known as Hep because that's what the rioters were screaming. And although the truth of the matter is that the Hep riots didn't kill many Jews, they caused destruction. Think almost like Kristallnacht type of activity. Much of it was aimed at the government or simply unrest. But as we know all too well in the world that we're living in, so often when people have all sorts of problems and things that are bothering them, they seem to take them out on the Jew. And so the Jew went from a place of emancipation under Napoleon to that being pulled back to doing their best to show others that no, actually we're just like you. And then in 1819, these cultural, literate, educated young Jews become the victims of riots across Western Europe. Well, what's the result? The result is push harder. There are certain things that we've got to get rid of. It's clear to this group, right, of young Jews that they haven't done enough. And so they will begin to take aim at what we would call weaker areas of Jewish law. So for example, the location of the bima, where the reader's table is in a synagogue. Where is it in a traditional synagogue? Where would you find the reader's table? In the middle. Right? The controversy in the 19th century was that these new synagogues wanted to move it to the front. Why? Because in a church, the altar is at the front. Good. Mitzitza bepeh. This is a part of the circumcision ritual in which the mohel, the one doing the circumcision, sucks the blood with his mouth from the open wound. Talk about things that were seen as barbaric, right? And we are living in an enlightened world where medicine is beginning to recognize that certain things get carried that way or spread that way. Mitzitza bepeh needs to go, according to these Jews. Head coverings for men. Kitniot, right? The legumes. The ban, the prohibition against eating those on Pesach also gone. Second day of Yom Tov. Now, why would this one be a major issue for Germans at the time? Second day of Yom Tov, keeping 2 days as opposed to 1 day. They work, therefore what? Yeah, but it's not just a financial issue, right? It's also what? Not so much Israel, but yes, right? And a big part of being a citizen in the 19th century is about being productive. About being productive for you and being productive for the state. Right? And Jews are not terribly productive because they take off all these days in a calendar year. Right? So if we can reduce the number of days in which we are taking off, we can become more productive, and again, we can be seen by our fellows as more deserving of full-fledged emancipation. By the 1840s, things will begin to coalesce, and particularly around a man by the name of Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger becomes a rabbi in one of these more reformed synagogues, and actually in several of them, particularly in Frankfurt. He is university trained. He is an excellent academic, particularly in areas of Jewish history and Jewish texts. Abraham Geiger in 1836, as a rabbi of a shul, writes the following: the Talmud and the Bible too, that collection of books, most of them so splendid and uplifting, perhaps the most exalting of all literature of human authorship, can no longer be viewed as of divine origin. Of course, all this will not come to pass today or even tomorrow, but it should be our goal and will continue to be so. And in this fashion, we are working closely with every true endeavor and movement of our day, and we will accomplish more by study than we could by means of 100 sermons and widespread religious instruction. For the love of heaven, how much longer can we continue this deceit to expound the stories of the Bible from the pulpits over and over again as actual historical happenings? To accept as supernatural events of world import stories of which we ourselves have relegated to the realm of legend, and to derive teachings from them, or at least to use them as the basis for sermons and texts? How much longer will we continue to perfect the spirit of the child with these tales that distort the natural good sense of tender youth? But how can this be changed? By driving such falsehoods into a corner, of course. By clearly revealing this paradox both to ourselves and to others, by pursuing into their secret hiding places all those who could seek to evade the issue, and thus eventually helping to open a new world for us in its place. A rabbi saying we can't do this anymore. Stop with the charades. We've been well educated for decades already. We know these stories aren't true. They didn't happen historically. Why are we continuing to teach that to our children? Enough, he says. And in the 1840s, he will be the driving force behind a series of conferences. Meaning, this entire movement starts from the ground up. It's lay people getting together. And they will then take these university-trained rabbis and appoint them people like Abraham Geiger. But never has this movement or this group of rabbis ever come together and say, what is it that we think? What is this thing that we're doing? What do we believe in? What do we not believe in? And so a series of conferences were arranged first in a city called Brunswick or Braunschweig, Frankfurt, and then Breslau from 1844 to 1846. These three cities, covering the vast majority of Western Europe during the time. And in each of them, subsequently, the ideas behind a reform movement will coalesce. At each one, they will discuss what were burning issues of their time and draw certain resolutions that they will all agree upon. And coming out of these conferences, a movement has been born. So, in Braunschweig in 1844, Kol Nidre abolished. Intermarriage allowed, as long, they said, as it was allowed by the local government. Frankfurt, 1845, Hebrew prayer intentionally limited. Reference to returns to the Zion sacrifice completely eliminated. Messiah continued, but as a universal idea. Mashiach was not somebody who was going to redeem Jews. Mashiach is somebody who's going to redeem all of mankind. triennial cycle of Torah reading, meaning we finished the entire Torah in 1 year. They were going back to an ancient practice that was amongst Alexandrian Jews in Egypt of reading it over the course of 3 years. Why would they do that? It makes the service shorter. Yeah. Modern baths were just as good as a mikvah. An organ can be played by a Jew on Shabbat. A mohel must be trained by a physician. Mitzitza b'peh, officially abolished. And mourning practices, Shiva, as we know it, dramatically changed. From 7 days to 3 days, no sitting on the floor, no ripping one's garments. Those were all seen as things that culturally were not acceptable. Breslau, 1846, Shabbat can be violated when necessary for services, for livelihood, or in the face of serious material loss. Rabbinic prohibitions in Shabbat are not binding. That is, things that come from the Torah itself, yes. Things that came from the rabbis, no. Second day of festivals, officially abolished. And so now we have a very different kind of Judaism. Here are the proceedings from one of those conferences. David Einhorn says as follows: the concept of Messiah is closely linked to the entire ceremonial law. The believer in the Talmud finds his salvation only in the reconstruction of the state, the return of the people, the resumption of sacrifices. Here lies the cause for our lamentations over the destruction of the temple and our yearning for the ruins of the altar. Ardent belief and unshakable courage were expressed in these hopes, uttered from the dark caves of our miserable streets. When times were tough, when we were living in the dark ages, we yearned for something like a return to Zion and a return to the temple. But now our concepts have changed. There is no need anymore for an extended ceremonial law. The earlier approach restricted divine guidance to the land of Israel and the people. The deity, it was believed, enjoyed bloody sacrifices, and priests were needed for penance. With increasing zeal, the prophets spoke up against this restricted view. Everybody knows the passage that has been told to thee, O man, what is good, and what the Lord doth require of thee, do only justly. Love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. The decline of Israel's political independence was at one time deplored, but in reality it was not a misfortune, but a mark of progress. Not a degradation, but an elevation of our religion, through which Israel has come closer to fulfilling its vocation. The place of the sacrifices has been taken by sacred devotion. From Israel, the word of God has to be carried to the four corners of the earth, and new religions have helped in carrying out this task. Only the Talmud moves in circles. We, however, favor progress. From this point on, from the 1840s into the second half of the 19th century, a movement in earnest will emerge. Actual congregations of people who have rabbinic leaders who are leading them in a particular direction, that has made some very significant changes to the way that Judaism has been practiced, and very significant changes to the belief system that had been undergirding Judaism up until this point. No, the rabbis don't have to be followed in all cases. No, many of these laws were written for a particular time period, and they no longer apply to us anymore. To do what Jews need to do, we have to be looking forward, not backward. That was the call of these synagogues. So this synagogue was built in 1865. Now, this is just a wood cutting, and unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore in Berlin. But you can begin to see, right? This is a different world. This is a very different type of synagogue. Now, Abraham Geiger, he himself will undergo a almost transformation from the young man who's a university student, who has a friend at the University of Bonn by the name of Samson Raphael Hirsch, a man whose story we're going to tell in 2 weeks from now. But they begin to drift apart as he himself begins to drift apart and becomes the force behind this new reform movement. He will also be the force behind creating the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the high school, the college for the science of Judaism. That phrase, Wissenschaft des Judentum, is going to be kind of the core of our lecture in the fourth week we have together. So it's important to note that it was associated with Abraham Geiger as well. But this This institute that he created, which we'll later learn is the third major Jewish institute created in the second half of the 19th century, it is there to study Judaism completely dispassionately. Jews were allowed into the university at this time, but Judaic studies was not. Abraham Geiger wanted nothing more than to create a chair of Jewish studies at the University of Berlin, but he was repeatedly denied. He was a great scholar. He easily could have gotten such a position. But it was denied, and so he had to create his own. A place where we would study Talmud and we would study Torah not as something which is a religious requirement, not as something that is part of my heritage or part of my belief system, but as something that needs to be studied scientifically in a petri dish, right? Dispassionately. There was no place to do it, and so he created a place to do it. What he didn't create, though, and by the way, this will exist until the Nazis destroy it. It was closed for a brief period, I think, in the 1920s, but it exists until the Nazis destroy it in 1942. But what Geiger does not create, and does not succeed in creating, are the other institutions necessary to take a movement and truly build it into a force. Amongst those, probably primary amongst those, if you want synagogues and more synagogues to adopt and more communities to adopt the kinds of things that you've been preaching, well, what do you need to do? You need to create rabbis. Yes. You can't just rely on people who will have a traditional upbringing but see things differently, or then go to the university and want to practice differently. You need to create those kinds of institutions. That does not happen in earnest in Germany. But at the very same time that this is happening in the German lands, there is something else happening across the sea in the United States of America. Because the United States of America is watching what is happening in Germany at this time. And the communities of early Jews here in the United States are not the most traditional Jews by very virtue of the fact that they're there in the United States. These are also Jews who have also similarly imbibed the ideas of the Enlightenment, because the United States is founded on the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so as they see what is happening in Germany, there are sort of two types of Jews in the United States at this time. You have your Spanish Portuguese Jews, right, for whom that is not terribly appealing. But you also have a community of German Jews who have left Germany, right, or other Western European Jews who have left and have come to the United States, and what they see happening in Germany makes a lot of sense for them in the United States. Not because they had to prove anything to anybody. They were fully emancipated, but because this was a type of Judaism that fit much better with the culture and the world in which they lived. And so already in 1841, this synagogue, which had been a traditional, I think even Spanish-Portuguese synagogue initially, in Charleston, South Carolina, becomes the first American Reform synagogue. In 1854, in Cincinnati, Ohio, a rabbi by the name of Isaac Wise takes over the B'nai Jeshurun shul in Cincinnati. He builds this edifice. What does that look like? Right? That is not your father's shtibel, right? In any sense of the word. And he is a force, Isaac Mayer Wise, and he also understands that to do this, and to do this successfully, one needs a lot more than just a few separate institutions. Right? By 1873, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations is formed. That is, the congregations who all were similarly minded come together in an official capacity. And in 1875, the Hebrew Union College is formed to actually train Reformed rabbis. So you have these series of conferences in the 1840s, which begins to give rise to a movement. You have in the United States a bunch of synagogues that have now come together, and an institution now that is going to teach rabbis to be leaders in these communities. But the principles or the conferences of 1840s didn't quite go far enough in terms of giving an actual curriculum or an actual shape to what it was we were training these rabbis to do. And so by 1885, the leaders of these communities come together and say, once and for all, we've got to set it out. What does it mean to be a Reform Jew? What is this that has been percolating up, right, and expanding outward, first in Germany and now in the United States for the last 45 years? And so they gather in Pittsburgh, And amongst the various things that they conclude is the following. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. Let's do that again. The legal system of Judaism, otherwise known as halakha, Jewish law, was a system for training the Jewish people during its time in Palestine. And today, we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such that are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. The break is clear. Reform Judaism does not recognize Jewish law as binding in any sense. If it's morally right, then yes, it is binding on us from a moral perspective. What ceremonies, what rituals should we continue? Only those that speak to us, that elevate our sense of spirituality, our sense of connection to the divine. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, that is kashrut, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with the spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's greatest messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. Somebody mentioned to me earlier a book that's come out recently, right, that tries to explain some of the world that we live in today, and how could it be that there are Jews who can support politicians and others who are anti-Zionist? Well, the answer is quite clear, and it's back here in the 19th century. You have an entire movement of Judaism that was founded on anti-Zionism. It was part of what its ethos was from its very start back in 1819, codified here in 1885. Now, the Reform movement has come a while from that, right? And has changed and has adopted other things, right, in the way, but the core of this is still there. If there is a dual allegiance, if the two seem to be in conflict with one another, well, then one's duties to the place in which they live, to the state in which they are, to the laws in which they abide, right, those come first. And so now we understand why the first graduating class of that rabbinical seminary had this particular menu, because the ceremonial laws had been cut. It isn't who we are. It's not part of Judaism. And so they can serve shell crabs, and they can serve at the end of a fleischig meal some ice cream. This story then takes us from the world of European Enlightenment all the way down to the creation of HUC, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and the Pittsburgh platform. But as we noted very early on, as we started this evening, this story does not happen in a vacuum, right? So we told this story through the orange boxes here. Well, immediately upon the creation of this Hamburg Temple controversy, another set of pins will start falling. Right? There will be an immediate reaction, which will set in motion a whole nother set of events, which will help explain many of the other things we see in our world today. And so I invite you back next week to the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy. Have a good evening. I can keep going, but you're free to go.